Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Meyer. I'm one of the co-directors of AI at Wharton, and I'm a professor here in the marketing department at the Wharton School. And welcome to AI Horizons, which is a periodic webinar series that AI at Wharton hosts, in which we discuss most recent advances in the way in which artificial intelligence is affecting all walks of life, whether it's people in their day-to-day decision making, whether it's organizations and firms, or whether it's society as a whole. So today we have an exciting opportunity to have as a special guest Matt Beane, who is an assistant professor of the Management and Technology program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And among other things, he's going to be talking today about his new book, which is called The Skill Code. And it's just recently come out. And what I'd like to do today is talk to him a little bit about, there it is, yeah, The Skill Code. Talk to him a little bit about what the book is all about, what inspired him to write it, and what the lessons it has for it, and also talk a little bit about Matt himself in terms of how he came into this business and so forth. I should say right off the bat, when I first saw this book, I thought, oh my God, it's a sequel to the Da Vinci Code. Okay. And it turns out it's not. Okay, it's not. So if that's why you're thinking about buying it, it's not the sequel to Da Vinci Code. But in many respects, it's a whole lot better. Whereas the Da Vinci Code was sort of a mystery and a suspense and maybe a little bit of a horror book that was purely fiction. The Skill Code is very much reality, and there's a lot of scary stuff in it, but there's also one thing that really separates it out from a lot of books that are out recently talking about some of the dark sides of AI. The Skill Code talks about some of the upsides and how we can kind of leverage AI in a positive way and how we can overcome some of the things that it handicaps us. So, Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Bob. Really delighted to be here.
Well, first of all, talk a little bit about yourself. How did you get interested in AI? Tell us a little bit about the program you're involved in.
Sure. So I was in the midst of a perfectly serviceable consulting career. I'll date myself here when the BlackBerry showed up on the scene.
Okay.
And I was consulting to senior executive teams as they contemplated really consequential decisions like merger and acquisitions and so on. And that technology, almost single-handedly and relatively speaking, overnight, transformed how they interacted with one another, how they made decisions, how they shared information. And that really turned my head around. At the same time, I started to read material that was, what was this? So that we're talking sort of mid-2000s, later 2000s, about the implications of advancing technology for the entire world. So Ray Kurzweil's first book became popular right around then. But I was also started to consume stuff coming out of, say, the MIT Media Lab, showing the use of new kinds of sensors and new algorithms to make very almost shockingly accurate predictions about human social behavior based on a tiny slice of data. So my wife and I decided I would apply to graduate school, and MIT let me in, which was a bit of a shock to both of us. So I went to get my PhD at the Sloan School in a program that's in the information technology group there, which is sort of a blend of computer science, economics, and sociology, with the express intent of studying how AI and robotics were going to change the way that humans accomplished various work goals. My particular interest is in how we build skill and how we learn. And so I've published original research in a variety of outlets and so on. But generally speaking, regardless of the title, there's always this question under here, like new technology washes up on our shores that involves some combination of AI and robotics. And how does this affect the way that we build skill and collaborate at work?
Right.
In the beginning, it was almost exclusively robotics. The last, say, 2.5 years, I've shifted rather heavily towards disembodied AI. And now it seems as if those streams are going to merge again.
Meaning disembodied AI, meaning what?
Screens, servers, computers, information processing AI that can't act in the physical world. So anyway, the short answer is I sacrificed a perfectly serviceable consulting career to go back to school to try to do original empirical research to really ask some of these questions about. There were a lot of let's see, heavy-handed and claims and hot air are out there about AI and the future, even back then in
Right,
the mid
right, yeah,
2000s. The volume is set now to 11 on those topics. So I wanted to start to try to answer them rigorously, and that's
yeah,
what drove me back to school. I landed at UCSB. I sort of paused in the middle of my PhD to go help found and fund a startup, and then finished. And UCSB is one of the few places that technology management department here, although I'm in San Francisco right now, but we're based in Santa Barbara, is one of, say, 3 or 4 places in the planet that's embedded in an engineering school, but is otherwise a business school. So there's this blend. I publish some papers in engineering and computer science outlets, and primarily, though, in business outlets. I can be multilingual in that sense here without penalty, so to speak. And so that's a good location for me. The faculty here have sort of comparable interests.
yeah, great, great. Well, I think you made an amazingly positive choice for all of us that you abandoned the consulting career and launched into what you're doing. So, Ruben, thank you for that. When I going through your book, I think it's the type of thing that these days, if you pick up a book that's on AI, immediately you go to two things. Which kind of a book is this? Is this going to be a book that's actually saying how AI is going to do everything and is going to take over the world and basically da 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 da? Or is it going to be that AI is basically going to be the end of the death of the human race, okay, or the end of the human
Right.
race? And so immediately when I started your book, I realized this is actually neither. Okay, it's sort of something that's really different. And so tell me a little bit about, how you got into the book and what the book is basically about.
Yeah, so the book is one key part of the skeleton of the book is my empirical study. So the way I do my research, primarily, although this is changing these days, is to find a likely consequential blend of robots and AI being deployed in some real workplace or a number of workplaces, and go there for between 1 and sometimes, well, 2.5 years is the longest one I've done. Um, and gather primary data, observational data on how people are actually using the technology, discussing it, making decisions about it, and systematize that. So because I think part of why the book is the way that it is that if you do that kind of work, it's very clear up close that things are much more complicated than everyone would like to claim. There is no strict bad story about technology,
Right.
nor is there a strictly positive story. And a lot of it is down to human agency, like the kinds of things that we do or don't do with it. Sometimes we do them without thinking much. And sometimes we are very conscious and deliberate. And so, I also I realize this in retrospect, I tend to design my studies presuming that the bulk of what I will find will be waste, failure, harm, despair, confusion, and so on. That's generally what happens with new tech. But I try to sample to find positive, sort of the positive needle in the negative haystack, like not a journalistic event where something positive happens in spite of all the turmoil, but amidst the welter of everyday work, systematic positive outcomes that are occurring independently of one another and yet in similar ways. And so that focus on what's happening that we can learn from that is constructive when you would least expect it, has driven me towards this blended view where, yes, the general force and trend of deploying these technologies in the beginning is, of course, messy. And here's a bit more how that looks. But there are some early deviants, so to speak, who are finding positive ways forward. We just don't tend to find them early. We tend to celebrate their success later as if it was inevitable
Yeah.
and a giant feat of the collective, when in fact there are some people who are sticking their necks out to mess around. And they may not even be aware of it themselves, but they're discovering new ways forward. So the short answer is the book itself sort of reflects that logic.
Okay.
The first third of the book is here's how people build skill. Middle third is there's a big threat to how people build skill
Yeah.
because of the way we're handling the tech. But here's the positive exceptions that I think we can learn from and
Yeah.
build
Yeah.
on as the back
Yeah,
third.
the beginning of the book gave not to kind of give it all away to people, but the beginning of the book has some great examples of what you're talking about in the context of surgical robots. And I don't would you want to kind of restate that or
Sure.
retell that story a little bit?
Yeah, that was the moment that sort of ignited the rest of my research trajectory. I knew just by looking at a robotic surgical, I was doing another study in a hospital with a different kind of robot, and a nurse dragged me into the OR and said, "You do robots and work, right? You're going to want to see this." She showed me the control apparatus for a robotic surgical device manufactured by a company called Intuitive. That is a 1,000-pound immersive Xbox controller or something. I mean, it has hand and foot controls and an immersive 3D display.
Well, what kind of surgery does it do? I mean, does it like open heart surgery? Does it,
Well, that's the great advance buried in the system is that it's minimally invasive surgery only. So you make small incisions, and there's a controller that this or a robot that this controller is attached to that has 4 arms with thin surgical laparoscopic instruments that get inserted through those incisions. And so you can operate in any part of the body where you can inject CO2 to inflate that part of the body. Inside a knee, believe it or not, you can add some CO2 to create a little visible space where you can operate. Typically, though, it's in the abdomen of the human. So everything from, ear, nose, and throat all the way down. And so I spent 2.5 years in the operating room documenting how this is used. But the main thing to say is that within 2 weeks, I saw that my intuition was, boy, learning how to use that must be very different than learning how to do surgery side by side with another human being. That's worth my dissertation. Within 2 weeks, I saw primarily that what would happen empirically is that a senior surgeon and a resident, a surgeon in training, would walk into the OR. They would get the patient anesthetized and make a few small incisions, attach this robot to that patient, and then both retire to 2 control consoles against the wall, 15 feet away from the patient. And the resident would then fold their arms and watch for 4 hours and do nothing. If they were lucky, they operated for, say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And that's because, and this finding has actually survived contact with over 30 occupations and other contexts in the years since. So because I wanted to know if this was generalizable, and it turns out it is. But in short, that resident was optional now in the procedure, and that was by design. The tool itself allowed a single person to do the entire job. And in many ways, LLMs are like this now for an expert, actually. But in short, that senior surgeon had to now make an elective decision to involve a trainee in work where they knew for certain that that trainee would be slower and make more mistakes than they would.
right.
And that meant the appropriate time to involve them was never. Like that, there's a patient on the bed, on the table. When's the right time? And so practically though, they knew this is a teaching institution. I'm supposed to let this resident practice. They would let them try something in the most simple, safest, shallowest end of the pool possible, which barely built neurons for that resident. And so they were leaving their residency with very limited qualification to do the job compared to what you'd hope.
Yeah.
That was the shocking moment that sort of woke me up to the challenge.
I'm just curious, just to jump in, is like from the senior surgeon's perspective, is the reluctance to want to bring, presumably one of their jobs is to train the junior person. And so is it part of it, the fact that, well, if I turn it over to them, basically then my value goes down a little bit if just a junior person could do it, or is it purely that they're just purely 100% thinking of what's best for the patient?
I never collected any data that indicated that surgeons were concerned about their own status or at all. It was a simple matter of 2 constraints. One, time on task equals revenue for the hospital lost. So the longer the procedure runs, the more costly it is to the hospital. And actually, surgeons are piece rate workers. So the faster you go, the more you personally get paid if you can do another procedure that day. So that's one set of constraints. The primary one, though, is the studies on time under anesthesia are they're excellent. There are decades of work there. The longer a patient spends under anesthesia, their risk of things like stroke, heart attack go up non-linearly over time. So keeping them, that time is actually direct, clear and present danger to that patient. So surgeons, a good surgeon will never rush, but they also will never deliberately slow things down.
Right. right.
It's tantamount to harm.
Okay.
It's one click away. So that was the primary concern.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And anyway, in short, that sort of novice optional finding in surgery, I found in, say, 2013. It was published in some form in 2015, then in a business journal in late 2018. Every bit of work that I've done since in some way has been to ask this question, like, is this unique to surgery? And if not, how does it show up elsewhere in the economy? Um, and the so that's been my work since, sort of moving away from surgery through places like warehousing and AI-enabled robots there, knowledge work, elder care, lots of different studies to test this in a variety of contexts.
So I mean, this is a pretty grim perspective in the sense that it's sort of saying, well, what we're going to merge it with a thing where you have robots and you have a few people who know how to operate them, but then that's it. That basically once that expertise goes away, who's going to come in to fill the gap and so forth. And so,
Yeah.
how do we fix it?
Right. Well, thankfully, surgeons on the ground were fixing it on day zero when I was there.
Okay.
They were just harder to find.
Okay.
And so this is the sort of positive needle in the negative haystack bit
Right.
that I was mentioning. And in every context I have since studied, there are also local folks sort of finding a new way to solve this problem. And that's because humans are incredibly ingenious. And if they have a goal, this is a finding from the 40s in sociology. I mean, if we have a goal that society holds out, skill is a good example, income is another, status, and so on. And the legitimate means of achieving that goal are blocked, then a rare few will engage in deviance to get the goal fulfilled anyway. And it turned out, this took me I'm a slow learner, I suppose. It took me about 2 years to see this pattern in my data, but I found what I then eventually called shadow learners in my data, surgeons who found ways to build skill in spite of that participation barrier in ways that violated norms for the profession. So to give you an example, they watched 2 orders of magnitude more video on YouTube of surgery than a
Hmm.
regular resident. Lots of what I call digital rehearsal. And it wasn't just watch it over and over and over and over again. They were engaging in a graduated set of practices where by the end it looked more like a, Sunday morning football, chalk and talk kind of
Right.
analysis.
Right.
And that was viewed as wildly inappropriate by senior surgeons. You
Well,
don't
why is
learn.
that? Why?
I have direct quotes from chiefs of urology saying you don't learn to be an actor by watching movies.
Okay, I see. Right.
There's research in surgery on what's known as dwell time, and actually this is ramified across lots of professions, that the best way to learn is to be in the operating room
Sure.
involved in procedures,
Yeah. Right.
which has been true roughly in human history for about 160,000 years until it's become increasingly challenging given all the intelligent technologies we're deploying
Right.
in the ways that it was in the OR. The other one, though, that should blow everybody's hair back is that residents who built skill really fast robotically found ways to operate with limited supervision by a senior surgeon, like when they were not in the room, for instance.
Okay.
That no one would ever think of that as an appropriate or effective means of building skill. Residents were willing to take the risk, a very few, to do that independent of one another across institutions to build skill because there was really no other path.
Yeah.
So obviously that's not a policy anyone would ever recommend. And the book was really my opportunity to say, well, what was it they were willing to take the risk for? What
Right.
were they trying to preserve? What were the conditions that were crucial for their skill development that were being blocked by the new use of the new tech that they could try to preserve?
Right. For those of you who might just be joining us, I'm talking with Matt Beane, who's the author of The Skill Code. He's at University of California, Santa Barbara. And if you want to jump in with any questions, there's a chat feature down there. Maybe feel free to make use of to join in the conversation. So a question that I have is, have you found that this these issues have touched your life personally in terms of as you think about developing your own skills, whether it's data analysis or anything like that, and
Right.
how are you kind of overcoming that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I did write I started last fall when I sort of shifted my research agenda more directly and comprehensively to studying the implications of LLMs and generative AI in
Mhm.
this domain. Last fall, I started a Substack, which is basically an online blog, sort of adding chapters to the book, if you will, that I would have put in there had I had my wits about me and had we already had ChatGPT in front of us. And one of the first ones I called "Don't Let AI Dumb You Down," um,
Okay.
which is, in a certain way, sort of summarizes the research. But the back third of it was addressing exactly this question. It became pretty apparent to me by watching my students, watching, doing ongoing observation in firms, and my own use of LLMs, that default use patterns compromised the conditions, the base conditions for skill development that I identified in my book and that I saw in all my studies. In particular, challenge, for instance, is, in the book, I identify three rough categories. This is the skill code itself of sort of conditions that humans really need to build skill very well and healthily. And one of them is challenge. We learn best when we are working close to the edges of our capability, not at it, but close, where we're focused and so on. It's not a comfortable place. You're focused, not relaxed, and it's an intense experience. If you use an LLM, I direct quotes from my students, and I can say for myself, you get an answer very,
Yeah.
very quickly with very low effort, very little struggle, actually. And that produces productivity. It gets results right away. And in many cases, the studies are obviously mixed on this, but in many cases, it's a dramatic improvement on what you could have done before. It would have made it
Right.
taking. And so that's a dramatic drop in challenge. And so you're trading away the conditions that you would need for ongoing skill development. I noticed this with myself in
Yeah.
exchange for that instant gift right back. It's
Yeah.
sort of a saccharine hit from an LLM.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Um, and so the back third of that post, "Don't Let AI Dumb You Down," I showed, I tried to solve this with ChatGPT itself. This gets to your point about using AI as part of the solution.
Right.
Um, there's a set of options in ChatGPT and other systems now where you can input custom instructions. There's a custom instruction set of boxes where you can basically give overarching guidance to the system as to how you want it to treat you in all your interactions. And I simply put a summarized version of the skill code from my book into those custom instructions. I told ChatGPT, I need to build skill as well as get outcomes. I need to be treated in these behaviorally specific ways to nudge me towards skill while en route to my outcomes. And ChatGPT is now productively annoying to me in ways that it is not for a garden variety user.
Yeah. Yeah.
It will ask me, for instance, are you sure you want me to just do this, or do you want to try yourself a little bit?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which most of the time I say no, and I roll my eyes, but at least I'm presented with the choice.
Yeah.
And it isn't this mindless trade. So
Right.
that's just one quick example. I think
If I can just
changing,
jump in
yeah,
on
yeah,
that one, that's really fascinating because I do think that there is a sense of that's out there that for on the one hand, it's this hidden danger associated with ChatGPT that basically, oh, it's this great tool, you can just look everything up, and people, or may not be conscious of the fact that this is actually dumbing them down. Okay, that they're not. I ran across this literature on search as learning,
yes,
and it's sort of this idea that basically one of the nice things about old-fashioned Google is it's forcing you to develop knowledge structures and it's forcing you to think how things connect and how what knowledge is and you're kind of on your own. You're having to it's giving you raw data and you have to construct it. And then ChatGPT is doing all the work for you. And so
right.
you never develop it. And then your knowledge is just whatever the answers are out there. So uh,
Right.
uh,
And I don't want to romanticize or nostalgize too much. Like, I have professors who told me that their learning was better because they had to go to the card catalog and
yeah, sure, right,
microfiche and so
right,
on.
right, yeah,
And
right,
I actually, there is research to support that. If you engage your body in physical movement,
yeah,
you writing by hand, for instance, and memory and learning and so
yeah,
on, these are well
yeah,
correlated. Um, So there's something there. At the same time, I don't, it's certainly not true in all cases that getting that quick
Hmm.
answer is destructive to your skill. So
Yeah,
we just have to be much more intelligent about when and how we're trading one for the other. Sometimes you're not.
yeah,
We just
yeah.
don't know. We haven't done the science to find out.
Yeah, yeah. I do know there's been, I'm sure you've seen it, there's been stuff that's coming out where people have been seeing using, well, maybe we can use ChatGPT to come up with research ideas, okay,
Yeah.
or come up with theories. And I don't know. Maybe I'm too old school and it's just the idea of doing that. I don't know that this is really going to lead us to a better place. I do think that using it to solve certain, like a calculator type mentality, or using it to like help, I could spend 2 hours figuring out how to program something, or a stat analysis in R, but I can just go to ChatGPT and it'll say, just here's the code. And I don't know, I
Moments.
don't feel, yeah, maybe maybe that's a skill I'm not, a debugging skill I'm no longer capable of because it's giving me the answers. I also don't feel I'm necessarily worse off by not having that skill, that sometimes where there's skills we're developing we don't really necessarily need.
Yes, precisely. And I think we need to have a nuanced but aggressive conversation about this. So, um, there were, when calculators came along, this was a conversation. When GPS came along, this was a conversation. Like, we're
Okay.
all
Yeah.
going to lose our sense of direction.
Yeah. Right.
Um, who cares?
Yeah.
Like, really?
Right.
And what if you lose your sense of direction at work, in your job with respect to some competence you had
Yeah.
before? I can't do a VLOOKUP table in Excel anymore because I've forgotten how to do that.
Yeah.
In many, many cases, it is a net beneficial to humanity that you no longer need to do. It's better
Right.
to direct your attention to new tasks and challenges.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying we need to hold on to all the skills that we used to have. In fact, it's some creative destruction there is great. Um, but right now, the modal response is we are unwittingly and almost always giving away this
Right.
challenge. And the other factor, the other two parts of the skill code are complexity, which is engaging with the broader universe of skills and data associated with your work in a productive way, and human connection, which we don't often
Yeah.
think of as associated with how we build skill, but a bond of trust and respect between humans is directly and
Mm.
primarily part of the mechanism of how and why we get the motivation to build
Yeah.
skill in the first place. Um, we're just trading those things away rather mindlessly,
Yeah.
and I can guarantee that sometimes that is exactly what we should be doing.
Yeah.
But do we know when and how?
Right.
Always? Certainly
Right.
not.
Yeah. Well, do you have any suggestions for, that says, well, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but we don't know, where and where, how to do the divide line. Do you have any suggestions or ideas on how you do that?
Right. So the book is in a sense my best first practical answer to the general public on what you can do for yourself and those you care about, your organization, to address this out in the real world, away from the ivory tower, so to speak. I will say for myself, I think probably the most valuable activities I can engage in are still fundamental research and development of um, clearer insight about when and how we engage in this trade-off, and what the consequences of that are, and ways that we can do this that leave us all better off, um, and building tools to help people see this for themselves. So that's sort of where I'm focusing my time. The book itself, though, I think is the garden variety answer, which is the first third tells you, to the best of my ability, over a year and a half, pulling together all known science about how we build skill in work at work, um, and giving you a nice, simple heuristic, this skill code, challenge, complexity, and connection, with 10-point checklists for each, so that anyone in any job can go look at their situation and say, are these in healthy supply?
Yeah.
And where they are, how can I scale that? And if not, what can I do to shore them up?
Yeah.
So that's the sort of straightforward answer. The middle part of the book says you are probably currently handling technology in a way that is an insult to that skill code in some
Right.
ways. And the back third is, here's how you can turn technology into an ally. And in short, the basic question to ask is there a way to use this thing, to deploy this thing, to buy this thing, to build this thing in a way that both generates productivity and enhances skill in the same move? It's not
Yeah.
always going to be possible, but I promise you, especially if you're, say, a manager in an organization with
Right.
purchasing power, and you're having conversations with the LLM vendors about, will you buy 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 licenses to our system? If you simply ask them, great, we're obviously compelled. What can you do to give us confidence that implementing this in our organization will both get us productivity and enhance the human capital inside our firm and the
Right.
ability of our workers to do their
Right.
jobs?
Right.
As far as I know, and I'm talking to all major vendors here, they will go, huh?
Right.
Um, it's not a primary
Yeah.
concern, and you can make it one as a purchasing
Right.
manager. As a
Yeah.
user, you can do the same. So that's the sort of it's certainly possible. I think it's much easier to fix that problem. It's a user UX problem for these systems than it is to build the foundation model in the first place. It's a sort of a user interface problem, sort of. Anyway, it runs deeper than that. But in short, if you know the skill code and then you can look at any particular technology, any work practice, you're better equipped, I think, to be a steward of your skill and your results.
Yeah, that sounds great. There's a couple questions that popped up. One of them is from Jillian Center. Do you see any generational differences in attitudes towards the decrease in challenge you described happening as a result of using LLMs like ChatGPT? And how can we help today's typical college students to embrace the challenge, or should we? Which seems to me like a great question.
Yeah, and the first thing I need to say is I don't have systematic data on this, and I haven't studied this generationally, and I think that is a very astute and interesting question. It speaks directly to an intuition that many people have on the street, so to speak, which is kids these days, they really don't, they don't walk uphill both ways like we used to. In short, though, the world has sort of become a bit of a padded playground.
Yeah,
And
right.
so I think there is truth to that intuition. I have seen it firsthand with students of mine, who even my best students, I mentioned in the don't let AI dumb you down post. I overheard my best students saying, "Oh my God, I'm so lazy now. I mean, I just hand my
Yeah,
assignment over to
right.
ChatGPT and it gives it to me, and I do tiny edits and I send it in." And they're still going to do it, but
Yeah,
they know. And
right.
so anyway, I really don't know systematically, and I do think that's worth looking into. I think that uh, to the extent that that is true, you sort of have an inbound inclination and aversion to challenge, then that's going to add insult to injury. We have fantastic studies on from psychology, sociology, and so on, in a variety of domains showing that humans prefer not to be uncomfortable. And challenge makes you uncomfortable. The kind of challenge that leads to learning makes
Right.
you uncomfortable. And so it has been, and that's a function, of course, of culture, but also biology. So I suspect that any human left to their own devices would prefer to avoid, that kind of challenge. So I just don't know about the merit of claiming that it's more prevalent today than it used to be, but it
Yeah.
wouldn't surprise me if it were true. I don't know.
But I also think though that I was thinking, for example, your first example of the resident. There was the one resident who just basically just kind of stood there with their arms folded, and the other one who basically had the initiative to go out and watch YouTube videos and sort of self-train. Is that sort of strikes to the heart of the problem, the fact that that challenge, complexity. These are costly, right? You don't necessarily want a challenge, and if you're lazy, and so forth. So in some sense, yeah, you're right, but it's in some sense speaking to people who really have the motivation and see intrinsic value in wanting to develop skills. And I can kind of think of it sort of like there are people who just you can go ahead and order out food all the time, or else you could kind of learn how to cook. And there are people who just want to. And there's an easy way of doing it, but I want to learn sort of the skill. And so one of the things you're saying is that, well, we got to kind of push people to see value in developing basic skills. And so I suppose there has to be a way of finding rewards for developing the skills, which or having that intrinsic knowledge, which maybe isn't there now.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that is it's worth highlighting that for the bulk of human history, this kind of learning, the most of our valuable skill comes from trying to address problems with people across expertise levels. Like I'm working with you, you're someone who knows more on a research problem. I'm a PhD student. I build capability as we jointly engage with that
Right.
problem. And so I would prefer not to, however. I mean, I engage with the relationship. I joined a PhD program, but when it comes up to the sort of addressing the problem, this sort of aversion to feeling uncomfortable I'd rather not, but you need my help and I am bound to you in various ways. And that's the primary coupling that we are breaking by the way that we're handling technology. So I think in general, relying on people's volition, willpower, intentionality to select conditions that will drive their skill is not enough. We had an engine that sort of mandated juniors or novices participation in the
Yeah.
work that everyone took for granted and is still obviously partially, and extensively functional. But it's sort of a nudge and in that direction towards skill just because I have to show up and help.
Right.
And so I think we need to, in addition to creating incentives and motivation, recreating structures that sort of mandate this cross expertise connection on a real problem, where it's just kind of I have to participate in some meaningful way.
Yeah.
Uh, that's probably a necessary complement to just telling
Okay.
people the right thing to do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess there's also um, uh, a little bit of a risk of, to the degree to which there are people out there who are incredibly self-driven and basically want to develop these skills. The maybe the concern would be of heightened polarization, where you have people who are really know how to do the stuff, and basically for them, this technology is just helping them get better or whatnot. Then
Yes.
you get other people who are just sort of lazy and can't write anymore, can't think anymore, and so
Yep.
forth. So. Uh,
Yeah, and I found this in surgery. Like in my first study, it's in
yeah,
the back, it's in my findings. So part one of that is that there was a Matthew effect for skill. In other words, the riches to the rich. So
yeah,
those who did race ahead, did this shadow learning kind of practices, they built skill. Senior surgeons saw them do that and gave them more opportunity to play, so to speak, at
okay,
the
yeah,
expense of other juniors' involvement.
yeah,
And so they quickly sort of raced away from the pack. The other junior residents weren't being lazy or not trying. They were trying very hard to learn in approved, traditionally understood ways, and those just
right,
weren't working. So they just got increasingly frustrated, saw their participation fading, didn't understand why. And you'd think, okay, this is a serious problem in that we have some of experts now who are way better than you might expect, but at least we have them, right? And it
right,
turns out, I have a section on this in my findings, and I've also found this now in other contexts. They were hyper specialized in a somewhat dangerous way. So they became very, very good at robotic surgery. You say you're a urologist, and
right,
you go
right,
out to a practice. In most practices where you're going to land, you have to do robotic surgery, and that hospital's very lucky. But you must also do vasectomies. You must also do
right,
other procedures,
yeah,
and you haven't really learned how to do those.
right,
And
right,
so we have this inverted problem where
mm,
very few hyper specialized experts get to land in a practice where they only do that one thing.
right, right, sure.
Um, so there's a new sort of supply and demand of skill problem that creates. Yeah, and we need better data on where and how that's happening in multiple
Yeah.
professions. But I can certainly say in surgery very clearly, it's creating multiple skill
Yeah.
supply problems.
Mariana Carrillo, okay, I had an interesting question. It's kind of related to the healthcare issue. What are your thoughts on healthcare providers integrating AI into their services as a means to promote and encourage preventive behaviors?
Preventative behaviors like, I assume, exercise and eat right and so on.
Yeah, that can, I assume, yeah, yeah, or even
Yeah,
possibly taking their medicine,
right.
when instructed to.
Exactly. In theory, this is a marvelous idea, and there are terrible ways to implement it. I have there's a PhD student in my department now who is interested in one aspect of this, which has to do with bringing AI-related tech into verbal interactions between patients and their institution, say the hospital. around their care and planning for their care. And without listening to the content of that speech, it listens to things like tone of voice and pacing and so on. It can provide an automated diagnosis of various mental health conditions, as well as lung-related conditions that might affect your speech. So you can back out a bunch of stuff that would then provide a recommendation to both parties in that interaction. One, to the patient, like, have you had this checked, or perhaps you might want to call this person for this, and to the person on the receiving end who's trying to be of service, getting a flag that maybe this person could use a referral to a social worker or to a cardiopulmonary doc and so on. So in theory, that's a rather magical and potentially greatly uplifting use of that tech that can provide information not just to the patient, but to multiple parties. Is it done with consent? Is it built in ways that respect the privacy of those that contribute their data? All of the sort of typical considerations we have now around respecting the sovereignty of individuals, and providing information in a way that enhances the quality of decision-making. These are, you could imagine implementing and building a system like that in a way that is destructive, or extractive or exploitative of some of those interests. And we've just got to be paying very careful attention to those.
Yeah. I'm thinking of ways in which in terms of preventive behaviors, how you can, so presumably AI would provide opportunities to monitor people and constantly be getting back to them, like, essentially being a nagging, I noticed you didn't do this today and so forth. And so there's an opportunity there, but it's sort of like anybody who's nagging them, there's also a tendency to just kind of easily turn that off. And so it might be, easier thing. It's one of these things where it's easy to kind of say, well, we can do this. It's another one to see if you can get people to adopt it and so forth.
Yes,
so.
I did a study of robotic telepresence in elder care in the 2013, 2014, in which we have an elder care facility, sort of independent living all the way through full palliative care at the end of life. And in this facility, there was a robotic telepresence system. Say, imagine a 4-foot tall Skype on wheels or Zoom on wheels kind of setup that could navigate from room to room and so on, that families could use to have conversations with their loved one in the facility. And both parties had to opt in for this, but when they did, this robot could come to the room of the person's loved one and ask if they wanted to play a game of chess or checkers or cards. And there's no human in the loop. The thing would autonomously move to the room,
Right.
and squat down, move the screen to eye level, and they could play a little game, or connect to them via a live video connection with their loved one if they're available and so on. That autonomous interaction that was approved by both parties was
Right.
universally well received, actually.
Right. Okay.
It's some novel form of entertainment for the person
Yeah.
living there.
Right.
And
Sure. Yeah.
we agreed, today's my robot appointment. The folks loved it. If they
Yeah.
weren't given the choice as to whether and how that robot showed up at their
Right.
doorstep, it would have been tipped down a stairwell, I'm very confident.
Yeah, right. Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. So kind of moving on to kind of like bigger picture, what are some of your thoughts on where we're headed? That effectively you kind of said, like, with each new OpenAI release and whatnot, that basically we're this step closer to true intelligence from machines and this sort of stuff. Then there's another view that says, well, look, it's actually we've kind of leveled off. What you see now is
Sure.
about where we're going to go. And I mean, what's your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Ethan Malik is obviously with you at Wharton, and he and
Yeah.
I have been connected since before we both started writing our books. And he and I
Yeah.
are, I think, roughly share the same view here, which is it is important to understand and prepare for all scenarios.
Right.
And so the two you mentioned are crucial to be aware of. One is, we sort of LLMs are here and they're going to improve a bit, but the bulk of the gain has been achieved. And the other one is it's a warm-up act. In fact, the
Right.
next,
Right.
right? But there are other ones. So I think another key one is they will be sued out of existence. And
Okay.
shut down,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So I think all of us as critical consumers, no matter our role, need to be you need to have a view that all of these things are possible. Maybe some of them are more probable, but you need to be
Yeah.
aware of and prepared for all.
Yeah.
The data
If
I
I could just
have,
jump in to kind of link that
yeah,
last one back to some of the earlier things we were talking about. I do think that if suddenly ChatGPT were to go away, there'd be a lot of people who'd be kind of screwed in the sense that basically that their ability to do things is so dependent on ChatGPT. Like I don't know how to write anymore.
right?
If suddenly that was to go away, we'd be in trouble. So
Yes. What would happen if GPS went away? It's a very
yeah,
interesting
right,
question, right?
exactly. Yeah,
Excel went away.
yeah,
I think the likelihood of that seems quite low compared to the other
yeah,
scenarios,
right,
but it's worth being aware of and tracking.
yeah,
The data I have, which of course all of us have biased data sets, but the data I have, I spend a fair amount of time with the companies building these foundation models and so on these days, and executives dealing with decisions around them, indicates to me rather strongly, and this is where I'm with Ethan, that the bulk of the capability deployment is ahead of us, not behind us. And that truly from the moment that ChatGPT arrived on our doorstep till now will in fact seem like a warm-up act. Um, it, in a certain sense, we don't really know what that's going to mean. If intelligence itself or something approximating it becomes too cheap to meter, as some are want to say, it's not obvious what that means. You might assume, oh, that instantly is going to solve a bunch of problems. But intelligence does not include decision-making rights, for
right,
instance. Like,
yeah,
then that'll be the new bottleneck. Like, who's authorized to unleash this intelligence in what direction becomes an
right,
instantly important question. Um, so anyway, the point is we know much less about a world that is, where 100 million human level AIs are now run in each of the data centers used to train these models.
right,
Uh, we can start to think about it, and we should, because I
yeah,
think it is likely. Um,
yeah,
the one where it's all sort of done in here and that's all we've got, also worth paying attention to. And then it's kind of a more typical general purpose technology diffusion story. Well, it particularly intense yet typical. So we'll have 10 to 20 years worth of figuring out how to work these things into our jobs, occupations, institutions, organizations. Um, and so maybe given that it's digital, given that it instantly diffused in a certain sense, and we're building apps on top of it now, maybe faster than with previous ones. So maybe 10 years. But it's funny how technologists tend to presume away the frictions associated with organizational life.
yeah, sure,
Institutional change is very slow. And in
yeah,
fact, for all of us and our feelings of sort of control and reality, that's probably a good thing. We don't want, a little friction is good. But yeah, my inclination leans in the sort of you ain't seen nothing yet direction.
okay, all right, okay, that's interesting. But we don't have too much time left, but I kind of wanted to switch to kind of maybe one final thing, which is, you work with students and they're always, and right now, if you are pretty much, at least in our field and most fields, kind of where all the interesting dissertations are going is in the area of AI something, technology something, how is it impacting people's lives and so forth. So if you were to, one of the difficulties with like, well, where is the field going is that's not really a researchable question, right? You can give opinions about it, but what would you think of if students were to come to you and say, Professor Beane, what would you recommend as interesting researchable questions that are on the table right now, and so forth? So
Yeah,
some ideas on that.
sure. So in a sense, these days I would say for the last year and a half, since maybe the ChatGPT arrived, um, I feel like I'm in this unusual position of maybe once every 2 weeks dropping and I say this, it feels almost hubristic to say. So I'll just say other folks that I respect and trust are doing precisely what I'm doing. So I don't want to
Yeah,
make
right.
myself sound unique, but every couple of weeks I drop a dissertation worthy idea into my Twitter feed
Okay.
because they're everywhere
Yeah,
now.
right.
It must be interesting what you go after, but there are all these new questions about how social phenomena will unfold as this kind of technology becomes increasingly available. That what a student should do, or anyone interested in doing research, actually, because in a certain sense, all of us are researchers now, is go get acquainted with some of that literature anywhere in a domain that's interesting to you.
Yeah.
Read a few key papers, recent stuff, and then look at your own reality. Look at these tools and go, well, that's obviously not true over there.
Right.
That it takes much less effort to see that now because the intensity of the phenomenon is so high. So my
Yeah.
general inclination is I don't want to tell a student anything other than go read a few more papers, come back and tell me how what you think is going on with respect to this tech just is new or doesn't square with those papers.
Right.
It's always been true. That's always been the right way to come up with your own,
Yeah.
an idea that you'll be sufficiently motivated to investigate, to go pursue.
Right.
Now, that said, off the top of my head, in our conversation just now, there's
Yeah.
been a number of them. So for instance, what does it mean for a team, an organization, or an economy, or a region if sort of undergrad level knowledge work capability were instantly free and directable by anyone with an internet connection? How
Okay.
would you start to think about how a team might function, for instance, if that were
Right.
true? No one has yet done that study.
Yeah.
Organization, no one has yet done that study, let alone when those technologies, as they are now starting to with OpenAI's model O1, which essentially can come up with a plan for its own action and execute on that plan. It's a very short plan, say between 5 seconds and a minute, or two. What's the implication as that amount of sort of memory and agency gets expanded for how humans get work done alone or in groups? How they relate to one another as they do that, as these systems become more capable? Those are all questions that are only possible to ask as of the release of O1 or around that, which was at most a month ago. I mean, I've forgotten the release date.
Right.
No one's done that study yet because it's just literally a brand new, it's hot off the press. So the role of agency in our economy, like what makes decisions, how are they made decided, and then how do people apply reasoning and intelligence to solve, and how is reasoning and intelligence applied to solve problems when humans are not the only source of reasoning
Yeah.
and intelligence? That just blows open a whole bunch of other questions we've sort of settled
Yeah.
up till now, in partially very unsettling ways. But that's if you're like me, like you, we got into research because things where things are unsettling to most, we get really interested and we want to
Yeah.
go understand how things work and why they do. So now is a great time to be asking questions like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what makes it such a great area, I know, like my background obviously was in something completely different, and I started getting into it mainly because there was so what we knew was so small relative to what we don't know, and it's just such an area where it's just exploding with research ideas and questions and so forth. So, so I'm as interested as I am about the area, I'm also interested in the questions that students are interested in as they come along and so forth, and. So let me, you mentioned one thing about sort of mentioned policy and so forth, and, regulation. I'll end on kind of on one thing. Let's say less than a month from now, we'll have a resolution to a big political decision. And depending upon how that comes, how do you think that's going to affect, depending upon which side ends up prevailing, sort of progress in AI and so forth?
Yeah, it's that I am neither qualified nor enthusiastic about
Yeah,
answering, but I would say it's not obvious to me that will budge the needle much.
right.
Right. I mean, both. It's one of these rare bipartisan issues these days that the
Yeah.
U.S. should be competitive in technology and in particular AI. I mean, I spent some time, less than many, I'm sure, in D.C. as of late, giving talks and engaging with um, politically oriented professionals and so on. And they're remarkably better informed than most presume, I think.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean it might not be evident in the sort of decision-making apparatus and bureaucracy,
Yeah.
but there's a better conversation happening there than one might expect, and it seems relatively more aligned. So there may be differences in terms of choices around things like ownership of the tech or the ability to collaborate across national boundaries and so on. I'm not an expert in those areas. If something were to really move the needle in a strong way on the development of intelligent technologies in the political sphere, I don't think it would be I wouldn't point to the presidential election as the thing
Okay.
that would be that political factor. Perhaps war. I mean, not to get too
Right.
dark
Right.
about it, but like
Yeah.
or giant cyber threats and so on, sort of
Yeah. Right.
digital
Yeah.
hostilities. I'd sooner look there than a political event inside the States to start to think about a political event being relevant
Yeah.
for the development of the tech. But
Okay.
I actually, it makes me want to go see like what really astute, technically informed, astute politicos and political science folks are saying about the implications of this election for tech. I could be wildly off.
Okay, great. Well, this has just been amazing. I've learned a lot during the course of this. I hope the people who are out there were able to. So thanks for stopping by. For those of you who came in late, this is Matt Beane, who's the author of the Skill Code, which is definitely, I'm sure you can pick it up on Amazon or whatever your favorite your book outlet would be, and it's absolutely a must read for anybody who's interested in technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. So this should be your, we already passed the summer, unfortunately, but this should definitely be your winter reading for everybody that's out there. Okay, so thanks a lot, Matt, and be in touch soon.
All right, take care, Bob. Thank you again
Yeah,
for the opportunity.
bye-bye.
Really enjoyed the
Bye-bye.
conversation.
Yeah.